He only went to watch the horse auction. But when one wounded mare looked at him, it felt like his whole life looked back. He only went to watch the auction. Just another gray day in a life that had forgotten how to feel. But when a scarred gray mare lifted her head and met his eyes, the noise of the crowd disappeared. In that single look, silent, fierce, and strange, something long buried began to stir. He didn't know it yet, but that glance would lead him into a storm of fire, redemption, and a miracle that no one in the valley would ever forget. The mornings in Livingston County always began the same way. Cold light spilling through the broken window of Jack Callahan's workshop, glinting off sawdust that hung in the air like quiet ghosts. He used to love that light once. It meant a new day, another table, another cradle, another home to build for someone. But since the fire, every morning looked the same. Gray, empty, and too long. The old radio crackled in the corner, speaking softly about real estate listings in Montana and insurance claims for wildfire damages. Jack barely heard it. His hands moved without thought, carving the edge of a piece of cedar, though he didn't know why. He hadn't sold anything in months. The town used to bring him work, window frames, rocking chairs, but now people just brought him silence and sympathy, the kind that hurts worse than pity. There was a photograph nailed to the wall, charred at one corner. His wife, Emily, and their daughter, June, smiling beside a white fence that no longer stood. The wood around the photo had turned black during the fire that took them. He kept it there, as if leaving it untouched would keep their faces real. When he stepped outside, the morning wind smelled faintly of burnt pine. The hills around Livingston were dry this season. The grass was brittle, the earth cracked. He watched the thin line of smoke rising from the north. Controlled burns, they said on the radio, to prevent another disaster. But the smell always found him, reminding him that he hadn't saved them. The mailbox at the end of his gravel drive clattered in the wind. A single piece of paper had wedged itself there, flapping weakly like a trapped bird. Jack pulled it free. A bright yellow flyer, creased and dirt-stained. Annual Horse Auction, Livingston County Fairgrounds, Saturday, 10 a.m. Below the bold letters, someone had scribbled in pen, "Free admission if you're not buying." He almost laughed. He hadn't been to the fairgrounds in years. Horses, laughter, the smell of hay. It belonged to another lifetime. Still, his thumb brushed the edge of the paper, and for a reason he couldn't name, he folded it carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. That evening, Jack sat on the porch as the sky turned the color of cold steel. He sipped coffee gone bitter from sitting too long on the stove. The sound of the wind through the trees made him restless. Sometimes, he thought he could hear a horse's cry from somewhere in the hills, a phantom sound from the old ranch down the valley that burned years ago. He shook his head and looked toward the darkening horizon. "Maybe I'll just go watch," he muttered, the words dry on his tongue. Just watch. It had been months since he'd gone anywhere, since anyone had spoken to him about something other than condolences. Maybe watching would be enough. Watching didn't hurt. Watching didn't demand that he live again. When dawn came, the world outside was frosted white. Jack buttoned his worn denim jacket, brushed sawdust from his sleeves, and took one last look around the shop. Half-finished chairs leaned against the wall, silent witnesses to a man who'd forgotten how to finish anything. He locked the door behind him and started his old Ford truck. The engine coughed twice before it caught. The road to the fairgrounds wound through open pasture and broken fences. On the radio, a slow country song played about finding what was lost in a place you didn't mean to go. He turned it off halfway through. By the time he reached the fairgrounds, the sun was high, and the parking lot was already crowded. Pickup trucks lined the dirt field, trailers hitched behind them, men in worn boots and women in wide-brimmed hats talking loud, laughing louder. The air smelled of hay, diesel, and something that reminded him of summers long gone. Jack stayed near the back, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the wooden pen where horses were tied. He had no interest in buying, no intention of touching anything alive. He was just there to feel noise again, to see people move with purpose. The auctioneer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers. Lot number 47. Gray mare, 5 years old. Injured, but strong. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "That one's got fire in her." Another voice answered, "Fire and no brains." Jack looked up. At the far end of the corral stood a horse, the color of silver smoke. Her coat was rough, streaked with dirt, but her stance, rigid, defiant, made her look almost regal. A thin scar ran down her shoulder, like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. The handler tugged at her reins, but she fought back, hooves striking the wooden rail with a hollow thud. Then it happened. The horse turned her head. Her eyes, dark, deep, alive, met his. For an instant the noise of the crowd dissolved. The auctioneer's chant faded to a hum, the laughter to a whisper. Jack felt his chest tighten, the world narrowing to that single gaze. There was no fear in those eyes, only a quiet recognition, as if she knew him from somewhere beyond this life, beyond the fire. He didn't breathe. He didn't think. The auctioneer barked. "Do I hear 500? 200? Anyone?" Jack's hand rose before his mind could stop it. 10, he said, his voice low but steady. The crowd laughed again. $10? You're kidding, right? The auctioneer shrugged. Sold for 10. A hammer hit the table. The sound cracked the air like thunder. The horse lifted her head, her nostrils flaring, eyes locked on him. And Jack Callahan, who'd only come to watch, felt something stir in the ashes of his chest, something he thought had burned away forever. He didn't know it yet, but the moment that horse looked at him, everything he believed about loss, about guilt, about the dead staying gone, began to shift. The world around him came rushing back, the sound of boots, the smell of hay, the sunlight breaking through clouds, and somewhere deep inside, the faintest ember of hope flickered to life. He took the reins with trembling hands, met the horse's gaze once more, and whispered, "All right, girl, let's go home." He only went to watch the auction, but sometimes the things we go to see are the very things that see us first. The drive back to the outskirts of Livingston felt longer than the way there. The wind had picked up, whispering through the cracks of the truck's old windows. Dust swirled around the tires as Jack glanced in the rearview mirror again and again. In the small trailer behind him, the gray mare shifted restlessly, her hooves clanging against metal. Her name wasn't Willow yet, not until she earned it. For now, she was just a wild thing Jack had bought for $10, though even he didn't understand why. When he reached his property, the The sky was fading into a bruised purple. His land stretched quiet and forgotten. An acre of brittle grass, a workshop that smelled of old timber and ash, and a collapsed barn that once held his tools, his memories, and his ghosts. He backed the trailer up near the barn and cut the engine. The sudden silence made his pulse ring in his ears. He opened the gate slowly, whispering, "Easy now." The mare backed up, her nostrils flaring, eyes wide as if the shadows themselves had teeth. Jack didn't approach. He'd learned, long ago, that sometimes the best way to calm something broken was to give it space to breathe. He unlatched the trailer door and stepped aside. The mare bolted out, head high, muscles trembling beneath her dusty coat. She stopped several yards away, turning sharply toward him. The air between them felt charged, as if invisible wires connected them. The wind carried the faint smell of cedar from his workshop, and the sharp tang of rain about to fall. She stared, unblinking, steady. He stared back. Jack saw the scar again along her left shoulder, a streak the shape of lightning frozen in flesh. It wasn't deep, but it carried the color of pain that never quite healed. Something about it caught him like a hook beneath the ribs. That same mark had burned across his arm the night he lost everything. A memory flashed. The roar of flames, the sound of June screaming for him to run, the ceiling collapsing before he could reach her. He forced the thought down. "Not tonight," he said, whispered to himself, more than to the horse. He walked to the barn, pulled the half-broken door open, and let the hinges groan. Inside, moonlight leaked through gaps in the wood, illuminating floating dust. He scattered some hay he'd saved from last winter, dry, old, but it would do. When he looked up again, the mare had followed, step by step, cautious but curious. Jack didn't move. He just watched her breathing slow, her head lowering slightly as she tested the hay with her nose. Her ribs showed faintly under her skin. She was hungry, but still proud enough to pretend otherwise. He understood that kind of pride. That night, he sat on a stool outside the stall. The crickets sang, the river hummed far away. He didn't try to sleep. He simply watched the silhouette of the horse move softly in the dim light. Somewhere between the rhythm of her breathing and the creak of the barn, the world grew still. When dawn crept in, the mare was lying down, legs tucked neatly beneath her. Jack smiled faintly for the first time in years. "You made it through," he murmured. "Guess we both did." For days, he kept his distance. He brought her water each morning, leaving the bucket inside the stall, never forcing her to drink. He'd hum while he worked in the nearby shop, a habit that used to make June laugh. Sometimes, he caught the mare listening, ears flicking toward him, her body still as carved stone. The townspeople noticed the truck parked by the fairgrounds that day and the horse trailer hitched to it. Word traveled fast in small towns. Sheriff Miles stopped by one afternoon, leaning against his patrol car, eyeing the horse through the fence. "Heard you bought yourself some trouble," he said, tipping his hat. "Guess I did." Jack's tone was neutral. "That mare came from down south," the sheriff continued. "There was a fire 2 summers ago. Burned a ranch near the Bitterroot Valley. Killed a few dozen horses. That one's the only one they found alive." Jack froze. His fingers brushed the scar on his forearm again. The sheriff didn't notice. "She's a handful," Miles said. "Be careful, Jack." Then he drove away, leaving a trail of dust behind him. That night, Jack couldn't shake the image. The horse alone in a field of flame, running through smoke, surviving when everything else turned to ash. He dreamed of fire again. But this time, when he reached through the smoke, it wasn't June calling for him. It was the gray mare, her eyes shining through the darkness. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the air in the barn cold enough to sting. The mare was standing near the gate, watching him. He reached out, palm open. She flinched, but didn't move away. "Guess you and I got the same ghosts," he whispered. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, slow as morning light spreading across the floor, she stepped forward. Her nose brushed the edge of his hand. A single breath, warm and alive, passed between them. He didn't name her that day. Not yet. Names had weight, and he wasn't sure either of them could carry it. But when he left the barn, the sun breaking through the low mist painted her coat in silver. She turned her head slightly, eyes soft but steady, as if asking him to try. Back inside his workshop, Jack set down his tools and looked toward the fields. He could see the faint outline of her shape against the light, alone, but no longer lost. He reached for the coffee pot, poured himself a cup, and muttered under his breath, "Well, looks like I'm not watching anymore." Outside, the mare lifted her head, as though she'd heard him. In that quiet space between man and animal, something fragile began to take root, something that neither of them, not yet, dared to call hope. The first real thaw of spring came late that year. The snow along the fence melted into ribbons of mud, and the creek behind Jack's property began to move again, slow and brown. Days stretched longer, the light returning little by little. And with it came the quiet rhythm of two living things learning to exist, side by side. Jack spent his mornings in the workshop again. The sound of a hammer echoed faintly through the valley, mixed with the far-off calls of meadow larks. He wasn't building for customers anymore. No orders, no deadlines, just shaping wood to keep his hands from shaking. From the open doorway, he could see the gray mare grazing in the paddock, her coat shining where the sun touched it. She'd stopped flinching when he walked by. That was something. Each day, he gave her a little more space to choose, whether to approach, whether to stay. Trust wasn't something he could rush, and she reminded him of that with every step she took away from him. Yet each evening, she came closer to the fence, ears turning toward his voice as he hummed the same old tune June used to love. The sheriff's words still rang in his mind. Only one survived the fire. He tried not to think about what that meant. The scar along her shoulder caught the light sometimes, glowing pale against her darker coat. It was healing, though it would never disappear. He ran his hand near it once, careful not to touch, and said softly, "We'll call that even, huh?" That night, rain rolled in, soft at first, then harder. Jack went out to check the barn, making sure the roof didn't leak too badly. He found the mare standing near the open stall door, restless but not panicked. The thunder cracked, and for a heartbeat she tensed, then stilled when she saw him. He whispered, "You're safe. I'm here." She blinked, slow, as if she understood. By morning, the rain had passed. The smell of wet earth filled the air, sharp and clean. The mare's mane was tangled and heavy, but her eyes were bright. Jack leaned on the fence post, sipping coffee. "You've made it through another storm," he said. Then, without thinking, he added, "Good girl, Willow." The name fell out of his mouth like something long waiting to be said. He froze. The horse lifted her head, ears pricked. "Willow," he repeated, quieter. "Yeah, that suits you." It was the name of the tree that used to stand outside their old home, a tree June loved to climb. After the fire, all that was left of it was a ring of black roots. But somehow, the name didn't hurt as much now. Maybe because it didn't belong to loss anymore. Maybe because it was standing right in front of him, breathing. Over the next weeks, they began to settle into a rhythm. Jack repaired the old corral, replaced the broken boards, and cleaned out the trough. He took to reading at night again, sometimes aloud, letting his voice fill the silence. Willow would stand near the open stall, listening, her breath steady. The small things began to change him. He stopped leaving dishes piled in the sink. He washed his clothes more often. When the mail came, he didn't throw it straight into the stove. Life returned not as a flood, but as a trickle, slipping through the cracks before he noticed it was there. One afternoon, while repairing the gate, he heard tires crunching on gravel. Annie Walsh stepped out of her pickup truck, her hair tucked beneath a wool cap. She carried a bag of feed over her shoulder. "Thought you could use this," she said, smiling like she didn't expect thanks. Jack took the bag with a nod. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said, looking past him toward the paddock. "That the mare from the auction?" "Yeah, calls herself Willow now." Annie studied the horse quietly. "She's got the kind of eyes that remember too much." Jack glanced at her, surprised. "Yeah, I noticed." They stood in silence, watching Willow paw at the dirt, her tail swishing lazily. Annie spoke again, her voice soft but sure. "My husband used to say that some animals don't need breaking. They just need someone who won't give up on them." "Your husband?" Jack asked. "Died last year," she said simply. "Heart gave out in the middle of hay season. I thought about selling the farm, but I guess I stayed for the horses." Jack looked down, nodding. "Guess that makes two of us." When she left, the smell of hay lingered. Willow stood by the fence watching the truck disappear down the road, ears flicking in the wind. Jack reached into the bag Annie had brought, poured the fresh feed into the trough, and whispered, "Looks like you've got a friend now. Maybe I do too." That evening, the sky blazed orange and violet as the sun slipped behind the mountains. Willow stood by the gate, and Jack leaned against the post beside her. They watched the light fade, neither moving, neither needing to. The only sound was the soft sigh of wind through the grass. He thought about June's laughter, about Emily singing in the kitchen, about the way the fire had stolen every sound that ever mattered. Yet now, standing beside this creature, he felt something unfamiliar. Peace, or maybe forgiveness, though he couldn't tell the difference. When night fell, Jack closed the barn door halfway and paused, his hand resting on the wood. "Good night, Willow," he said quietly. Inside, the mare shifted, then gave a low, gentle whinny. He smiled. Back in the house, he sat at his table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. On the counter sat the same yellow flyer from the auction, now smudged and creased. He picked it up, turned it over, and wrote 2 words on the back. "Thank you." He didn't know who it was for, the horse, the fire, or maybe life itself. Through the open window came the faint sound of Willow breathing in the dark, calm and steady. And for the first time in years, Jack let himself fall asleep without the weight of nightmares pressing against his chest. The valley turned green that April, the kind of green that makes the earth look new again. The air smelled of rain and wild clover, and Jack had started keeping the barn doors open all day letting the light fall across the dust like gold threads. Willow was stronger now, her coat glossier, her ribs no longer showing, and she had begun to follow Jack of her own will. Sometimes he'd feel her presence behind him before he even turned around, her breath brushing the back of his neck like a soft question he hadn't yet answered. Annie Walsh stopped by more often after that first visit. She always had an excuse, a bale of hay she accidentally over-ordered, or a new kind of grain she thought Willow might like. But Jack wasn't blind. He saw how her eyes softened when she watched Willow nuzzle his sleeve, how she lingered longer each time before driving back to her farm down the valley. "Your place looks better," she said one afternoon, standing by the paddock fence. She wore a faded plaid shirt and a straw hat, the brim shadowing her freckled cheeks. Jack shrugged. "Guess a horse makes a man tidy up." Annie smiled. "Or maybe it's the man making peace with himself." He didn't answer. She didn't expect him to. They walked the fence line together, talking little, but saying enough in the silence between words. Willow followed a few steps behind, head low, tail swishing lazily. At the far end of the pasture stood an old willow tree, one that had somehow survived years of drought and wind. Its long branches bent toward the earth like arms reaching for the ground. Annie stopped and touched the bark. "You planted this?" Jack nodded. "When my daughter was born. It was her favorite tree." Annie's eyes softened. "I'm glad it's still standing." "So am I." The wind rustled the leaves above them. Jack caught himself thinking how different this silence felt. Less like loneliness, more like rest. Later that week, Annie invited him to the farmer's market in town. "You should get out more," she said. "You can't spend all your time talking to that horse." "Maybe the horse listens better than most people," he replied. But his smile took the sting out of the words. At the market, the air was thick with the scent of roasted corn and coffee beans. People greeted Annie with warmth. She had a way of making everyone feel like she remembered them. Jack stayed close, unused to crowds. It felt strange, hearing laughter again, seeing life moving without tragedy hiding behind it. He caught sight of a poster pinned near the community board, "Wildfire Preparedness, sponsored by State Farm Insurance." He looked away quickly, heart tightening. Annie noticed. "Still hard?" she asked quietly. "Some things don't get easier," he said. "You just stop expecting them to." They drove home mostly in silence. Near the ridge, a storm was forming, dark clouds rolling slow and heavy. Annie parked by the fence. "Looks like rain again." "Yeah," Jack said. "She hates thunder." "You mean Willow?" "Yeah. Maybe she remembers the fire." Annie looked at him for a long time before speaking. Maybe she just remembers being saved. He wanted to tell her he hadn't saved anyone, that saving wasn't in him anymore, but the words stayed caught somewhere in his chest. That night, as rain swept across the valley, Jack went out to check the barn. Willow paced, ears twitching at every rumble of thunder. When he stepped closer, she turned sharply, eyes wild for an instant. Then, recognizing him, she let out a low breath, the kind that sounded almost human. Jack rested a hand against the stall door. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "I'm here." Outside, lightning split the sky open. For a moment, the world turned white, and in that brief light he saw Annie's truck headlights coming down the road. She stepped out, soaked, carrying a lantern. "I thought you might need help," she called over the wind. "You shouldn't be out in this," he said. "Neither should you," she shot back, smiling despite the rain. Together, they calmed Willow, their hands brushing over her damp coat, their voices low and steady. Thunder rolled again, but the mare stayed still, trembling less this time. When it was over, the three of them stood in the dim lantern light. Two people, one animal, bound together by the same quiet survival. Annie brushed the wet hair from her forehead. "She trusts you," she said softly. Jack looked at Willow, then back at Annie. Maybe she just ran out of reasons not to. Annie smiled faintly. Maybe we all do, eventually. When she left, the storm had faded into drizzle. Jack watched her taillights disappear down the valley road. Behind him, Willow snorted softly, nudging his shoulder. He laughed under his breath. "You like her, huh?" She tilted her head, as if agreeing. Days passed. The valley dried, and the world felt gentler. Jack fixed the roof, oiled the hinges, and sanded the old barn door until it swung without a sound. Annie returned with a new halter one afternoon, a simple leather one, hand-stitched. "For her," she said. Jack ran his hand over the stitching. "You didn't have to." "I know, but sometimes giving something small makes the big things easier." He met her eyes, unsure what to say. She turned to Willow, slipping the halter gently over her muzzle. The mare didn't resist. "See?" Annie said softly. "She lets me." "She lets you because you're kind," Jack said. "And you?" He smiled faintly. "I'm learning." That evening, as the sun burned low and gold behind the hills, Willow stood between them, her coat glowing like molten silver. The world felt suspended, balanced on a breath neither wanted to end. When Annie finally drove away, Jack stayed outside long after dark, watching the stars blink alive one by one. Somewhere deep in the barn, Willow shifted and blew softly through her nose. He whispered into the night, "We're getting there, girl. One day at a time." And though he couldn't see her, he swore he heard her hooves shift in answer, steady and certain, like a promise kept. By June, the valley had settled into the kind of summer that made the air shimmer above the fields. The days stretched long and golden, filled with the hum of bees and the smell of dry hay. Jack spent most of his mornings repairing fences, his skin darkening under the Montana sun. Willow trailed behind him at a distance, grazing near the creek, but never too far. She was calmer now, almost gentle, but there was still something inside her that flickered, like a small flame that refused to go out. Annie visited once or twice a week, bringing jars of honey or loaves of bread from her kitchen. They'd sit on the porch in the evenings, talking about nothing and everything, how the grass grew faster after rain, how the wind shifted before a storm. Sometimes she'd laugh at something small, and the sound would startle Jack because it felt like a sound the world had forgotten. But peace has a way of testing those who find it too soon. The day it happened started bright and still. Jack woke to the scent of dust in the air. A warning. The wind had shifted overnight, blowing hot and dry from the south. He looked up toward the mountains and saw a faint line of smoke curling above the ridge. Wildfire season had come early. By afternoon, the air was hazy. The radio droned warnings about fire insurance coverage and safety protocols, words that made Jack's stomach tighten. He stepped outside, scanning the horizon. The smoke had thickened, crawling closer. Willow stood at the fence, her ears flicking nervously, nostrils flaring as if she already knew. "Easy, girl," he murmured, running a hand along her neck. Her muscles trembled beneath his touch. He spent the rest of the day soaking down the roof and clearing the dry brush near the barn. Annie called from her truck on the hill. "If it comes this way, you head for my place, you hear?" "I'll be fine," he shouted. Back. "Fine's what people say before it isn't," she replied, her voice lost in the wind. By dusk, the sky turned the color of rust. Ash began to drift like snowflakes, silent and strange. Jack felt the old fear rising in his chest, the same cold, choking panic that had gripped him the night his house burned down. His hands shook as he filled the trough with water. Willow's eyes caught his in the dim light. For a moment, she wasn't just a horse. She was a mirror. He saw in her what he didn't want to see in himself, the memory of running too late, of saving nothing. Then thunder rolled, not from the storm above, but from the fire line miles away. The wind roared, carrying the scent of burning pine. Willow reared, her hooves striking the stall. The boards groaned. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears. "Willow!" he shouted. She kicked again, wild-eyed, foam flecking her lips. He tried to open the gate, but she lunged sideways, nearly knocking him off his feet. The world narrowed to noise, the crackle of fire, the pounding of hooves, the scream of wind. He could taste ash on his tongue. His heart felt like it might burst. And then, in the middle of the chaos, something inside him broke, not in pain, but in surrender. He dropped the rope and stepped back, hands open. "All right," he said quietly. "You do what you have to." For a heartbeat, she froze. Then she stopped thrashing, chest heaving. Her eyes locked on his, wide and wild, but no longer afraid. He moved forward slowly, one step at a time, until he stood close enough to feel her breath against his face. "Not this time," he whispered. "I'm not running this time." Lightning flared on the horizon, illuminating the scar along her shoulder. For a split second, Jack saw it glowing pale like his own. The memory of his wife's voice, his daughter's laughter, the sound of the collapsing roof, all of it swirled together in one unbearable rush. But this time, he didn't turn away. He reached up and laid his hand gently on Willow's scar. She didn't flinch. The fire didn't reach them that night. The wind shifted just before midnight, pushing the flames north. By morning, the sky was gray with smoke, but the land around his property still stood. Jack hadn't slept. He sat on the barn floor with his back against the wall, Willow standing beside him, her breath slow and steady. When Annie arrived, she found him there, his face streaked with soot, his eyes red but calm. "It skipped us," she said softly. "Yeah," he answered. "Guess we got lucky." Annie crouched beside him. "You look different," she said. Jack gave a tired half smile. "Maybe I finally got tired of being scared." She looked at him for a long time, then at Willow. The mare lowered her head until her muzzle brushed Jack's shoulder. "She trusts you now," Annie said. He nodded. "She taught me how." Outside, the light began to return. The valley smelled of wet ash and rain. Annie stood and brushed the soot from her jeans. "Come by the farm tomorrow," she said. "I could use your help fixing a fence the fire took out." "I'll be there." As she drove away, Jack walked out to the pasture. The sun was climbing, soft and gold through the smoke. Willow followed him, her steps quiet in the damp earth. He turned toward her, his voice barely a whisper. You were right to fight, he said. I just didn't know it back then. She snorted softly, the sound almost like a laugh. Jack took a deep breath. For the first time in years, the air didn't hurt his lungs. He felt the world as it was. Not safe, not easy, but alive. And so was he. That night, he sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the horizon glow faintly from the last embers of the fire. Willow grazed nearby, her silver coat catching the moonlight. Guess we both made it, he said. The horse lifted her head, looking at him for a long moment before turning back to the grass. Somewhere behind them, the creek murmured softly, carrying away the ash. Jack leaned back and closed his eyes. For the first time since the fire years ago, he didn't see flames when he dreamed. He saw rain, soft and endless, falling over a valley that was learning, slowly, how to forgive itself. The morning after the fire passed, the valley looked like a half-forgotten memory. Gray ash clung to the grass, and the smell of smoke hung in every breath of air. Jack walked the fence line slowly, boots sinking into the damp soil, counting the charred posts that would need replacing. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that holds its breath. Willow followed behind him, her hooves leaving soft prints in the soot. The mare's coat, usually silver in sunlight, looked darker now, streaked with ash. Jack turned and brushed her neck with the back of his hand. You did good, girl, he said. She snorted, a small puff of steam in the cool air, and nudged his shoulder. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Not that they could. But sometimes silence speaks louder than any voice. Later that day, Sheriff Miles drove up the dirt road. His cruiser, dusty and battered, crunched to a stop by the barn. He climbed out, squinting under the brim of his hat. You all right, Jack? Jack nodded. Fire missed us by a mile. The sheriff looked past him toward Willow, who was grazing near the fence. That mare's still with you, huh? I'll be damned. Why's that? Word came down from Bitterroot, Miles said, leaning against his car. Somebody finally tracked where she came from. That ranch fire, turns out she wasn't just any horse. She was part of a breeding line worth a fortune. They called her Silver's daughter. Jack frowned. You saying she belongs to someone? Belonged, Miles said. Her owner died in the blaze. The insurance company's still sorting it out, but you might get a visit. Maybe someone wanting to claim what's left. Jack looked toward the mare. She's not a thing to be claimed. Miles gave a half smile. That's not how the world works, friend. But between us, I'd keep her close. Sometimes money brings trouble. When the sheriff left, the quiet returned, heavier this time. Jack leaned against the fence, thinking. He had no papers, no right to her, just 10 crumpled dollars and whatever bond had grown between them. But the idea of losing her stirred something raw in his chest. That night, thunderheads built up over the mountains again, though no rain came. Jack lay awake, listening to the restless wind scrape the roof. In the barn, Willow shifted, her hooves tapping softly against the floor. He rose, pulled on his boots, and went to her. The mare lifted her head as he entered, eyes glinting in the lamplight. I heard what they said, he murmured, that you had another name, another life. He stepped closer, careful. But maybe that's not who you are anymore. Maybe we both get to start over. She moved toward him, slow and steady, until her forehead pressed against his chest. He stood still, the lamplight flickering between them. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "I'm not letting them take you." The next morning, a black truck rolled into the driveway. A man stepped out, tall and sharp-eyed, wearing polished boots and a leather jacket that didn't belong in the country. He introduced himself as Mason Cole, representative of a livestock claims company. "Mr. Callahan," he said, shaking Jack's hand a little too firmly. "I'm here regarding a horse, Silver's daughter. Records show you purchased her at auction?" "That's right," Jack said cautiously. "Do you have proof of ownership?" Jack hesitated. "Only a bill of sale. $10. Mason smirked. "Then you might understand my position. Technically, she's still property of the late owner's estate. There's talk of selling off remaining assets." Jack folded his arms. "She's not for sale." Mason's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Callahan. It's just a matter of price." The conversation turned cold. Jack refused to sign anything. Mason warned him about legal consequences and promised he'd return with papers. When the truck finally disappeared down the road, Jack's hands trembled with anger. He walked straight to the paddock. Willow was there, standing by the stream, watching him as if she'd been listening. "They think you're a thing," he said, voice rough. "Just numbers on paper." She flicked her ears and turned her head, as if unimpressed. That night, as stars bled through the haze, Jack sat by the barn door with a cup of coffee, too wired to sleep. Annie found him there, arriving unannounced, headlights cutting through the dark. "He came by my farm too," she said, stepping out. "Asked questions about you, about the horse." Jack's jaw tightened. "Figures. He's not bluffing, Jack. Those people don't care what's right. They care about money." "Then they're going to be disappointed," he said quietly. Annie sat beside him, brushing the mud from her boots. "You can't fight everything alone. You don't have to." Jack looked at her, at the worry softening her features. "You think I'm stubborn. I think you're scared of losing something again." He didn't answer. She didn't push. In the barn, Willow stirred, her hooves shifting on the straw. Annie stood, brushed her hands on her jeans, and looked toward the door. "You ever wonder why she found you?" "Luck," Jack said. "No," Annie replied. "Luck doesn't look you in the eye the way she did." When she left, the air felt heavier. Jack walked into the barn, crouched near Willow, and rested his forehead against hers. "They can take everything else," he whispered, "but not this." In the days that followed, he worked harder, rebuilding fences, sealing the roof, preparing for whatever storm was coming next. Willow followed him everywhere now, no halter, no rope. When strangers drove past, she'd position herself between them and Jack, her stance protective, almost defiant. The first time he tried riding her, she hesitated, then allowed it. Her body moved beneath him with power and grace, and for a moment he felt something he hadn't in years: freedom. The wind against his face, the ground rushing under them, the world wide and open again. He laughed, startled by the sound of it, half joy, half disbelief. But trust is always tested. A few days later, Mason returned with another man, this one with a badge and a clipboard. They called it an inspection. Jack met them by the fence, his arms crossed, heart pounding. Willow stood behind him, ears pinned back, sensing his unease. "We're confirming the identity of Silver's daughter," Mason said smoothly. "You'll need to surrender her until legal ownership is verified." Jack didn't move. "She stays here." The officer cleared his throat. "Sir, let's not make this difficult." Before Jack could answer, Willow reared, hooves slamming the ground between them. The men stumbled back, startled. Her eyes flared with that wild fire again, her nostrils wide. Jack stepped forward, voice calm, but fierce. "You see that? She's not property. She's alive." The men exchanged a look, muttered about coming back with paperwork, and retreated to their truck. When they were gone, Jack leaned against the fence, breathing hard. Willow lowered her head beside him, her breath steady. "You saved me again," he said softly. She flicked her tail and bumped his arm, almost playfully. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the hills, Jack sat on the porch watching her in the fading light. He thought about everything he'd lost, and everything he'd almost lost again. Maybe the test wasn't about keeping her safe. Maybe it was, about believing that something this fragile could stay. Inside, he pulled a scrap of paper from the table drawer, the same yellow flyer from the auction. On its back, below the words, "Thank you," he wrote, "Trust isn't something you earn once. It's something you keep choosing." He folded it carefully and slipped it into his wallet. Outside, Willow lifted her head toward the twilight sky, her coat gleaming like silver under the first stars. Jack whispered, "Whatever comes, we face it together." And from somewhere deep in the quiet, he swore he heard the soft sound of her answering breath, steady and sure, like a promise that neither of them would ever run again. By late August, the air grew brittle again, the kind that cracked under sunlight. The river behind Jack's property had shrunk to a thread, and the fields whispered with every gust of wind. The mountains to the west stood hazy, veiled by the faintest trace of smoke from wildfires burning hundreds of miles away. Every year, it was the same warning. The earth dried, the sky went still, and memories began to stir. Jack had learned to live with the ache that fire left behind, but some nights it still came for him. The sound of beams splitting, the smell of burning wood, the helpless roar in his chest. When he woke, Willow would always be there, her breath steady, grounding him. Sometimes he wondered if she dreamt of it too. He spent most mornings mending fences and cutting back the dry brush, making the place safer. Annie stopped by with cold lemonade, teasing him that he worked too hard for a man who swore he was retired. "If you ever get tired of building fences," she said one afternoon, "you could help me fix that old barn of mine. It leaks worse than your roof." Jack smiled, wiping sweat from his brow. "You sure you trust me with your roof? After everything you've done for that horse?" "Yeah, I do." They worked side by side the following week. Annie's laughter filled the quiet corners of the old barn as they patched holes and replaced boards. Sometimes she'd hum under her breath, and Jack found himself humming along without realizing it. It felt normal, like something he hadn't earned but had somehow stumbled into anyway. By the time the sun dipped low behind the ridge, the barn glowed in the orange light of dusk. Willow grazed nearby, the fading sunlight turning her coat to silver. Annie leaned against a fence post and said softly, "You ever think maybe she found you on purpose?" Jack glanced at her. "You believe in that sort of thing?" "I didn't," she said, her eyes still on the horse. "Not until she looked at me today. There's something about her, like she carries the things we can't say." Before Jack could answer, a low rumble rolled through the valley. Not thunder this time, something deeper, meaner. He looked up. A column of dark smoke rose from the hills to the south, spreading fast. The wind was blowing wrong, Again. Within hours, the news stations called it the Ash Ridge Fire. The sheriff came by, warning everyone to prepare. "It's not close yet," Miles said, "but if the wind shifts overnight, it'll come through this valley by morning." Annie's farm sat lower in the valley, closer to the tree line. Jack felt a knot twist in his stomach. "You need to move your horses," he said. "I will," she replied. "You too. Promise me you won't wait this time." He didn't answer. That night, the wind howled like a living thing. Sparks from the distant ridge carried on the air, tiny red stars tumbling through the dark. Jack paced the barn, packing feed, wetting towels, checking the trailer hitch on his truck. Willow grew restless, hooves clattering against the boards. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the orange flicker crawling along the horizon. The smell hit first, pine resin and smoke, thick and heavy. Then came the faint roar. Fire had found its voice again. Jack flung the barn doors open, shouting over the wind. "Come on, girl! We're leaving!" Willow resisted, muscles tense, fear rising through her like a tide. For a split second, her eyes flashed the same wild panic he'd seen that first day at the auction. Jack grabbed her halter, his hands shaking. "Please, Willow, not this time. Trust me." She trembled, torn between flight and faith. The fire's glow brightened the sky until it looked like dawn. Embers rained down, sizzling against the wet ground. Jack coughed, pulling her forward. "Move!" he shouted. She hesitated, then lunged, following him into the storm of heat and light. The air burned his throat as they ran toward the pasture gate. Sparks stung his arms. The horizon behind them roared, trees collapsing, wind snapping through the flames. Willow stumbled once, her hooves slipping on the wet grass, and Jack pulled her upright with everything he had. "Almost there!" A crack split the sky as a burning tree fell across the lower fence, blocking the road to Annie's property. The fire raced along the ridge, pushing closer. The world became a blur of smoke and light, the kind of chaos that strips everything away. Jack felt the same helpless terror as years before, the same guilt clawing up his throat. But this time, something inside him refused to surrender. He turned to Willow, his voice raw. "We go through." He climbed onto her back without a saddle, gripping her mane. She reared, snorting hard, the heat reflecting in her eyes. Then, with a sound like thunder, she charged forward. They burst through the smoke, flames flaring on either side. Jack ducked low, feeling the sear of heat against his face. Willow's body moved like liquid muscle, every stride pure power and defiance. The world roared around them, but they didn't stop. Not until the ground gave way to cool air and open fields. When they reached the creek, Jack dismounted, collapsing beside her. Willow's chest heaved, her sides slick with sweat and soot. The fire was still behind them, painting the sky blood red, but here, by the water, the world was quiet. He pressed his forehead against her neck. "You saved us," he whispered. She turned her head slightly, brushing his cheek with her nose. Annie's truck headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the haze. She jumped out, running toward them, tears streaking her smoke-stained face. "Jack, oh my God, you made it!" He nodded, breathless. "Barely." They watched the hills burn through the night, sitting side by side in silence. When dawn finally came, the fire had moved on, leaving only black earth and smoke rising like ghosts. Willow stood by the creek, her coat dark with ash, but her eyes calm. Annie reached over, squeezing Jack's hand. "You could have died out there." "So could she," he said quietly. "But we didn't." The first rays of sunlight touched the valley, turning the water gold. Steam rose from the scorched ground. Jack looked at Willow, her silhouette framed by the morning light, and felt something deep shift inside him. He'd spent years trying to bury the man who failed to save his family. But in the fire's second coming, that man had burned away for good. All that remained was the one who stayed. And beside him, the horse who had taught him how. The fire left behind a silence that didn't feel like peace. For days after the flames died, the valley looked like the bones of something ancient. Blackened trees, gray soil, the air thick with the ghost of smoke. Even the river moved slower, as if mourning the hills that once shadowed it. Jack spent those mornings walking the property in disbelief. The ground was still warm beneath his boots, fragile as old paper. Each step stirred up the smell of loss. Willow followed him through the ruins. Her coat, usually silver, was dull and stained with ash. She limped slightly on her left hind leg from their desperate run through the flames. Jack kept a close eye on her, washing the wound with water from the creek. "You'll be all right," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for her or for himself. The sheriff drove by 2 days later, his cruiser coated in soot. "We got lucky," he said, leaning out the window. "Lost 3 barns down south, but the town's safe. FEMA and the insurance folks are already setting up a relief fund." He paused. "You need anything, Jack?" Jack looked around at the scorched pasture, the burnt fence posts, the world stripped to its frame. "No," he said. "Not anything they can give me." When the sheriff left, the quiet returned. Jack sat on the steps of his porch, holding a handful of blackened soil. Beneath the ash, he felt something small and hard, a seed still intact, clinging to the dirt. He turned it over in his palm. "You're tougher than you look," he said. Then he dug a shallow hole near the fence line and buried it gently. That night, the wind changed direction. It carried the smell of rain, real rain, heavy and full. Jack stood in the doorway as the first drops fell, hissing against the hot earth. The sound was a lullaby he hadn't heard in years. Willow stood in the open, letting the rain wash over her, head tilted toward the sky. By morning, the ash had turned to mud, and the valley breathed again. Jack worked quietly, rebuilding one section of the fence each day. Annie arrived with supplies, wood, nails, bandages for Willow's leg. She didn't talk much, just helped him measure, cut, and fit the new boards. When they stopped to rest, she said, "The grass will come back faster than you think." "I don't know," he said, glancing at the charred hills. "Seems impossible." "Nothing stays dead forever," she replied. "You taught me that." Jack smiled faintly. "I think Willow taught both of us." Weeks passed. The rains came steady, soaking the ground until small threads of green began to push through the black soil. Jack watched them every morning, coffee in hand, amazed by their stubbornness. Life doesn't ask permission. It just returns. One evening, he found Willow standing near the spot where he'd planted the seed. A tiny sprout had broken through, fragile, but alive. The mare sniffed at it, then looked back at him. "Yeah," he said softly. "I see it too." The sight hit him harder than he expected. For the first time since the fire, he felt something shift, hope, quiet and steady, growing beneath the ruin. That same night he cleaned the inside of the barn until the wood shone again. He hung new lanterns, stacked the feed neatly, and laid down fresh straw. When he finished, he stood in the center of the aisle, breathing in the faint smell of hay and oil. "We're still here," he said aloud. Willow, from her stall, turned her head as if to answer. A few days later, Annie brought a small box. "It's from the community," she said. "They wanted to help you rebuild." Jack opened it. Inside were envelopes, donations, notes, names he hadn't heard in years. One card caught his eye. For the man who didn't run this time. He closed the lid carefully, his throat tightening. As the weeks turned into months, the valley transformed. Patches of grass spread across the hills, followed by wildflowers that painted the earth in yellow and purple. Birds returned. The air grew clear again. Even the creek, once sluggish, sparkled in the sunlight. Willow's limp healed, and she ran across the pasture, mane flying, as if daring the wind to catch her. One afternoon, Jack was mending the last section of fence when he noticed something new. A group of riders approaching from the road. Mason Cole was among them, dressed in a crisp shirt and that same polished arrogance. "Mr. Callahan," he called, dismounting. "Quite the comeback you've made." Jack didn't look up from his work. "What do you want, Mason?" "Business," the man said smoothly. "That mare of yours has made headlines. The horse that outran the fire, they're calling her. There's interest, sponsorship, coverage, maybe a documentary. It could mean real money." Jack set down his hammer and finally met his eyes. "She's not for sale. Not for a story. Not for anything." Mason smirked. "Think about it. You could rebuild faster. Insurance won't last forever." Jack stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "I already rebuilt what mattered." Mason studied him for a moment, then laughed quietly. "Suit yourself, Callahan. But don't be surprised when the world comes knocking." He mounted his horse and rode off, his entourage following in a cloud of dust. Jack watched them disappear, then turned to Willow, who stood by the creek, head high and unafraid. "They don't understand," he said. "You're not a story. You're the truth." That night, the first fireflies of the season blinked across the field. Jack sat on the porch, watching them drift like slow stars. Willow grazed nearby, the new grass brushing her legs. Annie joined him, handing him a glass of sweet tea. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked. Jack nodded toward the pasture. "That right there. Just this. A place where things can grow again." Annie smiled, resting her head against the porch post. "That's enough." As the night deepened, the valley grew quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of loss, but the stillness that comes after something sacred has been saved. Jack looked out toward the hills, dark against the stars, and whispered, "Thank you." Maybe he was talking to the rain. Maybe to Willow. Maybe to the fire itself for burning away the man who could no longer live. Whatever the truth, the earth heard him. And in the morning, a single green shoot had grown taller than the rest, swaying in the wind like a small flag of surrender and survival. By early autumn, the valley had changed so much that it was hard to believe it had ever burned. Green rolled across the hills again, thick and soft, as if the earth had decided to forgive itself. The air carried that faint sweetness only September can hold, half summer, half memory. Jack's land was alive with small noises. Crickets under the porch, wind in the new grass, and the steady sound of Willow's hooves as she moved through the pasture. Jack had rebuilt the barn by then, not the same as before, but better. The boards were fresh and clean, the roof sturdy and painted a warm brown that caught the light like honey. The old sign that once read Callahan Woodworks had been replaced by something else. A simple wooden plank burned with the words, "The Haven, for horses that still believe." He hadn't planned the name. It had just come to him one morning as he watched Willow stand at the fence line, her mane tossing in the wind. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about every broken thing that deserved another chance. News spread quietly through Livingston County. Within weeks, 2 farmers brought their injured horses to Jack's gate, one with a twisted leg, another starved and skittish from neglect. Jack took them in without question. He didn't advertise, didn't charge. "I'm not running a business," he told Annie. "Just trying to make sure they're not forgotten." Annie smiled. That's what makes it work. She came often now, bringing supplies and stories. Sometimes she'd stay until the stars came out, helping Jack clean stalls or patch fences. There was an ease between them that didn't need words. When they worked together, even the air felt lighter. One afternoon, she brought a young boy, her nephew, Tyler. He was small for 12, with a quiet face and eyes too old for his age. "He's been having a hard time at school," Annie said softly. "Thought maybe being around the horses might help." Jack nodded, showing the boy around. Tyler didn't speak much, but his eyes followed Willow everywhere. She was grazing near the far fence, silver against the golden field. "She's the one from the fire, right?" he asked finally. "Yeah," Jack said. "She's seen worse days than most." Tyler stepped closer to the fence. Willow lifted her head and took a step toward him, curious. Jack watched the boy's hand tremble slightly as he reached out. Willow's nose brushed his palm, light as breath. "She trusts me," Tyler whispered, surprised. Jack smiled. "Sometimes they know before we do." That simple moment set something in motion. Tyler began visiting every weekend, learning to groom the horses, feed them, speak softly so they'd listen. His laughter returned first. Thin at first, then fuller, brighter. Jack noticed how Willow followed the boy around the paddock like a patient teacher, each step calm and certain. By mid-October, there were 5 horses at the Haven. Each had its own story, scars, burns, tremors that never fully went away, but they all shared the same quiet determination. Jack found comfort in their rhythms, in the sound of hooves and breathing, the soft creak of leather harnesses. Life had finally found its balance. One morning, Annie brought over a framed photograph. It was of Jack and Willow standing by the rebuilt barn, the sunlight slanting through the dust like gold. "The paper wanted to do a feature on you," she said. "I told them no interviews, but they could print this picture if you didn't mind." Jack studied it for a long time. The man in the picture didn't look like the one he remembered. His face was still weathered, the lines deep, but there was something softer in his eyes, something unguarded. "It's fine," he said. "If it helps the others find their way here." Annie placed a hand on his arm. "You've done more than that, Jack. You gave people a reason to believe in something again." He looked away, embarrassed. "I just built a fence." "No," she said gently. "You built a place where broken things don't have to stay broken." That evening, after she left, Jack walked out to the field. The sun was low, spilling orange light across the grass. Willow stood by the creek, her reflection rippling in the water. He watched her for a long moment before saying, "You started all this, you know." The horse turned her head, ears twitching toward his voice. "I just went to watch that auction," he said quietly. "That's all I meant to do." Then you looked at me and suddenly everything changed. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of pine and rain. Somewhere nearby, the first geese of autumn cried overhead. Willow stepped closer, her muzzle brushing his shoulder. He placed his hand on her neck, feeling the warmth beneath her coat. "Thank you," he whispered, "for finding me before I was gone for good." The days grew shorter after that. Frost gathered on the grass each morning, and Jack spent more time in the barn, mending gear and repairing saddles for neighbors who couldn't afford new ones. He refused payment, only asking that they bring carrots for Willow or blankets for the new horses. Word of the haven spread further. People began to send letters, some from nearby towns, others from states away. A rancher from Idaho wrote about a mare who wouldn't eat after losing her foal. A woman from Oregon offered to donate hay for winter. Every message ended the same way. "Thank you for what you're doing." Jack didn't know how to respond. He'd never set out to do anything heroic. He just didn't want to feel useless anymore. Yet every time he looked out across the pasture, saw the horses healing and running again, he realized that purpose wasn't something you found. It was something you built. One quiet act at a time. As November came, a light snow dusted the valley. The hills glowed pale under the early moon. Jack stood outside the barn, pulling his jacket tighter around him. Willow stood beside him, her breath steaming in the cold air. "You know," he said softly, "if I hadn't gone to that auction, I'd probably still be sitting in that workshop, waiting for nothing." Willow nudged him lightly, as if saying, "And you didn't." He smiled. "No, I didn't." Inside the barn, the other horses shifted in their stalls, the warm sound of life filling the night. Jack took a deep breath and felt it settle in his chest, calm and clean. For the first time in years, the world wasn't something he was surviving. It was something he belonged to again. He looked up at the sign above the barn door, "The Haven," and felt its truth. It wasn't just for them. It was for him, too. Winter arrived quietly that year, not with storms or thunder, but with a stillness that settled over the valley like a long exhale. Frost spread across the pasture in thin white webs, catching the first light of dawn. Jack woke earlier than usual these days. Habit, not necessity. There was always something to fix, some gate to oil, some creature to tend. The haven no longer felt like a place he lived in. It felt like something alive that breathed through him. Willow had grown thicker through the season, her winter coat shining pale beneath the rising sun. When she moved, her breath hung in clouds, her steps deliberate and strong. Jack watched her through the kitchen window as he poured coffee. "You're tougher than the weather," he murmured, and smiled at how true that felt. The morning mail brought an envelope he didn't expect. The return address said Montana Agricultural Board, stamped with the state seal. Inside was a letter, short, official, polite. They wanted to recognize the Haven as a rehabilitation program for abused and displaced horses. There'd be paperwork, inspections, maybe even funding. But at the end, in careful handwriting, someone had added, "We heard about the horse that saved a man." Jack stared at those words for a long time. Then he folded the letter and placed it on the table beside his coffee cup. He didn't need recognition, but maybe the horses did. Maybe they deserved to be seen, truly seen, for what they'd given. That afternoon, a car drove up the long dirt road, a small sedan with dust on its fenders. A woman stepped out, holding the hand of a young boy. Jack recognized the face before she spoke. It was the boy's mother. "We heard about this place," she said, her voice soft. "My son lost his pony last year. He hasn't said much since." Jack nodded gently. "You're welcome to look around." The boy was maybe 9 or 10, small and pale, his eyes hidden beneath a wool hat too big for his head. He didn't speak as they walked past the paddock. Horses lifted their heads to watch, snorting softly, curious. The boy's mother smiled weakly and whispered, "He doesn't talk much anymore." They stopped near the creek. Willow stood apart from the others, grazing under the bare willow tree that had somehow survived every fire and frost. The boy's gaze fixed on her, though he said nothing. Jack knelt beside him. "That's Willow," he said. "She's seen some rough days, but she's not afraid anymore." The boy didn't answer. But when Jack stepped back, the child slipped forward, one small hand clutching the fence post. Willow raised her head, her ears flicking toward him. The world went quiet for a heartbeat. Then, slowly, the horse walked forward. Her hooves sank into the soft ground, leaving deep prints in the frost. She stopped just a few feet away, her breath fogging the cold air between them. The boy lifted his hand without thinking, and Willow leaned close, touching his fingers with her nose. Something broke open in that stillness. The boy's shoulders shook once, and a sound escaped him, a soft sob that turned into something like laughter. His mother covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Jack turned away slightly, giving them the space that healing needs. When he looked back, Willow was standing perfectly still, her eyes calm and deep as water. The boy whispered something too quiet to hear. But Jack knew the tone. It was the same sound he'd made when he first touched that scarred coat, when the weight he'd carried for years had finally begun to lift. A few minutes later, the mother thanked him. "I don't know what you did," she said, voice trembling. "But he hasn't smiled like that since his dad passed." Jack shook his head. "It wasn't me." He looked toward Willow. "It never is." After they left, Jack lingered by the fence. The valley was silent except for the soft crackle of frost melting in the sun. Willow stood at the far end of the pasture, her silhouette framed by the golden light. He walked to her, resting a hand against her neck. "You did good, girl," he whispered. Again. She shifted her weight, nudging his shoulder, the same way she had that night in the fire. The day passed slowly. Jack spent the afternoon sanding a new sign for the front gate, replacing the old one that had begun to fade. The letters read the same, but he added one line beneath: "A place where the lost come home." When evening fell, the first snow began. Thick flakes drifted from the sky, soft as feathers. The barn glowed warm from the inside, lamplight flickering through the cracks. Annie arrived with 2 thermoses of hot cider. "Heard you've got visitors again," she said, stepping into the barn. "Yeah," Jack said, smiling. "A boy and his mom. She thought she was helping him, but I think it went the other way." Annie grinned. "That's how it works, isn't it?" They stood together watching Willow and the others settle for the night. The horses shifted in their stalls, their breath fogging the cold air. Outside, The snow kept falling, quiet and steady. Annie touched Jack's arm lightly. You ever wonder if this was always supposed to happen? You and her? He took a long breath. I used to think life was just a string of accidents, but now, maybe it's all just chances we're brave enough to take. They didn't speak after that. The kind of silence they shared didn't need filling. When Annie left, Jack stayed a while longer. He opened the barn door and stepped into the falling snow. Willow followed him out, her coat white with frost. The sky glowed faintly pink in the west, and the world felt clean again. He thought of the boy's small hand, of that look in Willow's eyes, the one that had stopped time the day he first saw her. He understood it now. It wasn't just recognition. It was reflection. She had seen him before he'd remembered how to see himself. He turned to her and smiled. You knew all along, didn't you? Willow lowered her head slightly, her ears flicking forward. Jack reached out, tracing the edge of her mane. That's the look, he said softly. The one that changed everything. The snow deepened around them, blanketing the ground, erasing every scar, every track of fire and pain that once carved through their lives. The valley, the barn, the horses, all of it stood wrapped in silence and light. For the first time, Jack didn't feel the need to remember or to forget. He simply stood there, breathing the cold air, feeling the steady heartbeat of the earth beneath his feet. And beside him, Willow breathed too, alive, unbroken, and home. If this story touched you, tell me what part stayed with you the most. I read every comment, and your words truly matter here. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Another quiet moment where a man, an animal, and fate cross paths in ways that change everything.